Hello everybody and welcome to the round glass review for the Super-W-Komura 75mm f6.3. What's that W stand for? Wide. That's right, super wide 75mm. Hey! 4x5 lenses have finally entered the arena. That's right. So let's get going here. I could not find production years for this lens, but this lens was advertised as being included with some cameras as a stock lens option in the early to mid 70s. Typical lens uses for a 75mm would be landscapes. That's like the primary use. 75mm lenses would also be pretty good for architecture. This lens would afford very limited architecture work due to the lack of movements, which we'll talk about throughout this video. This lens would also potentially have some product and close-up work uses when your working distances are short. However, the vast majority of users for this lens, at least according to the threads and the handful of sample photos I've seen online, tend to stick to landscapes, as landscapes generally require few or no movements. This lens provides very limited movements. And the movements that landscapes generally use, things like your rear tilt or your swing, front or rear tilt and swing movements, don't cause the negative to shift outside of the image circle quite as rapidly as, say, rise and fall or shift. For your bottom line up front, I know of only two Retrofocus 4x5 or writ large format lenses. Those are this one and the Super-W-Komura 90mm sister lens. The Retrofocus design allows this lens to be used on a far wider array of cameras than would a traditional non-Retrofocus 75mm large format lens. If you are looking for a wide-angle 4x5 lens that can be used on many, many cameras, this is the one that should be on top of your list. As a note, I had a Will Travel 45 custom printed for this lens because I'm not missing anything by not having movements, and it performs quite well inside of that camera. So this is an ideal Will Travel lens. Your focal length, angle of view, and rear nodal point are 75mm and 93 degrees on 4x5, with a 104mm rear nodal point on any format. This lens was sold as a 4x5 lens with no movements or a 6x9 lens with fairly decent movements, actually. The aperture range, assuming you have the standard Seiko shutter, is 6.3 to 45. I know of no other shutters that this came with, though I think it was possible to have this put into a Copal shutter at some point as an after-purchase action. The element and group count are 8 and unknown. Komura never published the group count. The design type is Retrofocus. The filter size is 72mm. Closest focus is going to depend on the camera that you mount this on. Your focus drive type is not applicable, although if there are autofocus large format cameras, I'm unaware of them. The native mount is, again, not applicable. It comes in a Seiko Zero. I think it's a Seiko Zero shutter. It's the same size as a Copal Zero. And so this lens will fit onto the lens board of any 4x5 or 6x9 sheet film camera. The dimensions are 104mm by approximately 75mm. It weighs in at 454 grams. I believe that's with the Seiko shutter. The maximum coverage is 158mm at f/22. The angle of coverage is 71.5 degrees based on calculations using the image circle and focal length from the rear nodal point at an infinity focus. And the movements are functionally 0 on 4x5, and vignetting is visible on images at the wider apertures, even when properly zeroed and centered. Even at f/22, where the image circle is the largest, the corners will clip with more than a millimeter or two of vertical or horizontal movement. I did try this lens with some tilt and swing, and it delivered both of those without corner clipping. My best tip for this lens is one you kind of heard already, which is that it makes an awesome 4x5 viewfinder lens. I have loved using this lens on my Will Travel and suggest that as a strong option for using this lens. My second tip is that, yes, this lens is really most at home with landscapes, but you should try it with some tabletop or studio work too. This is an interesting performer when used close up. My next tip is that although this is a portrait lens, focal length on smaller formats, and it could be capable of portraits on 4x5, it's not ideal for that unless you have a way to keep your model and camera perfectly still from the moment you focus through when you load the film and take the photo. Lastly, this lens isn't huge and it isn't heavy. I mean, not compared to some 4x5 lenses, but it does feel more at home in a custom camera than it does, say, on a bellows camera. For users who mount this to a lens board, as I did for a couple of years to use on my Ghibellini, it does become kind of big in a camera case. It is, yes, the second largest shutter-mounted 4x5 lens that I own, falling behind the Schneider Tele-Arton 360 f/5.5, but in fairness, almost every 4x5 lens is smaller than that Schneider. So the point of all this is plan your camera and use out before buying this lens. It's not the biggest, it's not the heaviest, but once it's in a lens board, it does take up space. No diagram was available anywhere, and believe me when I tell you I looked high and low. I have searched online many times for the diagram, searched for old Komura PDFs, searched my print books, and even kept an eye out on auctions for Komura print materials to see if anything with the design would ever pop up. I've done this for 2 years. I have never found a diagram for a single Komura large format lens. Komura does indicate that this lens has 8 elements. There's no group count, and given the 75mm AOV and 104mm flange focal distance, or specifically 104mm rear nodal point, we know that this is a retrofocus lens. Retrofocus lenses have an advantage in 4x5 with longer working distances and less light loss at the corners versus traditional wide-angle lenses, though at some relatively minor image quality cost. Sharpness I've read many users describe as suitable or acceptable for my needs. I would say that sharpness is highly dependent on your aperture, and that with this lens, if you stop down beyond f/22, then your sharpness loss will be quite noticeable. I shot this lens a lot at f/16 and f/22 and found it to be a good performer. Build quality is good, though the way that the cells disassemble is a bit weird. Each cell, which each have 4 elements, can be unscrewed in half. I assume that this is for cleaning, which is nice, but it's not like anything I've seen in other lenses. It seems like it may have been a way to cut down on production costs. Contrast is simply fantastic. This lens delivered rich color and good contrast across the aperture range. Aperture stars only appeared in one shot for me, and they were only okay. To be fair though, this one sample is the sun through trees, so it's hard to gauge if the star quality is due to the lens or the trees or both. Out of focus areas require close focus and a wider aperture to achieve, and they're surprisingly not bad. I tend to think of vintage wide-angle retrofocus lenses as not being good blurry area performers, but this lens speaks a little bit differently. Light loss I tested once with some Harman Direct Positive paper. Here's a shot at f/6.3, and it looks fine and good and all to my eye with the pleasing tunnel-like character that leads my eye to the bobcat, and that's the subject. Now here's that photo at f/22, and the photo's entire nature changes. The now by comparison quite apparent light loss is gone, and all the details become a whole lot sharper. This lens's performance across apertures changes quite drastically. Flare does occur, and the severity is linked directly to the light point strength and the position in the frame, of course, but strong flare from this lens is quite damaging to images. Ghosting occurs quite often as well with this lens, and, unfortunately, lens hoods of a suitable outward angle for it are hard to find and basically useless. I have yet to meet the retrofocus lens that creates ghosts I like, and this lens is no exception. The amount of ghosting it delivers is quite strong, and keeping the sun well outside of your frame will help prevent that. Balance with cameras depends solely on your camera. I used this on a Ghibellini Proxima and on the Will Travel, and I liked it equally on both. It's worth noting that unless you're using the Will Travel, if you're using a field camera or a monorail, those are going to be on a tripod. So really the weight issue with a 4x5 lens is whether or not the weight of the lens is too much for the front standard to prevent it from either rotating or sliding. That was not an issue I had with this lens at all. On my Ghibellini Proxima, the Schneider 360 f/5.5 Tele Arton, oh boy, yeah, that is way too much for that camera to handle. This was not. So whatever camera you put this on, you're probably going to have zero issues with the front standard shifting unless you have problems with your front standard. I'm gonna say something controversial. There are times when large format photographers can be snooty. This is far from universally true, by the way. Many are quite nice and very in tune with their art. But I have read opinions from more than a couple that retrofocus lenses aren't serious tools for the large format photographer. I find that perspective on the world damaging to the overall photographic community. Not all photographers need or will benefit from using a Schneider 72mm f/5.6 Super Angulon instead of this lens. Do I personally like the Schneider more? Oh, of course, because Schneiders are one of my favorite lens brands and that 72 is a particularly stunning lens. But can I use the Schneider to its fullest? No, because I own neither a 5x7 camera or a bag bellows. So what does the Schneider buy me that this one doesn't? Yeah, I ain't got an answer for that either. This was my first ever very wide angle 4x5 lens, and it taught me a lot about using 4x5 for landscape work. I find the images it creates captivating, with a near cinematic quality that feels like it would be just as home in a large format photo as in a frame of an establishing shot from either an Alfred Hitchcock or Orsen Welles movie. Yeah, it sacrifices a small amount of sharpness and it lacks movements, and the f/6.3 image is a hair dark on the focusing screens. All of those are accurate and fair observations. But it's relatively light, and it creates scenes embodied with character, presence, and a visual appeal that I have, frankly, not yet matched in the so-sharp-they're-sterile Schneider 72mm images I've taken. The Komura is a lens worth investing in and using. I have never once regretted taking it on a photo shoot with me, and often it has made the difference between a good day shooting and a mediocre.